Good afternoon. I'm Brooks Berndt, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. A warm welcome to all of you for this month's installment of Creation Justice webinars, where we seek to put faith into action for the greater good of humanity and for our common home. Today, we have got quite a webinar lined up. I am grateful to be joined by my co-host, the Reverend Michael Malcom, who is the Executive Director for the People's Justice Council and Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. Michael, I am interested to hear your thoughts for today as we frame our conversation. I think, to be honest, we are performing a much needed public service. We're filling a need. We are giving people a break from the new episode of Impeachment Season 2. And I hear it's getting better reviews than the first season, but as important as that is, we have a calling, and that calling of ours becomes especially important beginning January 20th and beyond. And so help us frame today's conversation as we look at the possibilities for 2021. And before we get into introducing our stellar lineup of panelists, go ahead, Michael.
Thank you, Brooks. I am excited about this conversation. Let me first apologize. They're doing work at my home, and so they cut the power off, so I'm having to use my phone, which makes me look a bit distorted, I guess. That being said, I'm excited about what is happening right now in this place and excited about what is transpiring in the midst of. We have had a rough few days. And we have not only had a rough few days, but it looks like 2020 is just carried over into 2021, and we expected things to be different. However, there is a sliver of a silver lining that we need to really take hold of. In that, Brooks, let me tell you, I'm excited at the same time, while I'm also carrying this weight of anger and carrying this weight of distraught and carrying this weight of being frustrated with everything that has transpired and taken place. I'm also excited because for the first time in a long time, Georgia has gone blue. And it was because of the voices of those who are often marginalized and often overlooked and undervalued and underserved that joined together and collectively said, we don't want that anymore. And we decided to do something different. And so now we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to work with an administration that has said that they will do the right thing when it comes down to the environment, when it comes down to environmental justice. And as those who are proponents of creation justice, that excites us. And at the same time, in us being excited, because we are faith leaders, we know that we are also called, because of the moment that we're in, to be advocates and comforters as well. And so we're here today to find out what is actually possible in the midst of all of what's going on with this, given this administration that is coming on, as well as all of the activities with the outgoing administration. Not just what is possible, but what is our role as clergy? What is our role as prophets? What is our role as faith leaders? And so I'm excited to hear from our guest, Brother Clarence, my good brother and friend, Brother Anthony, and my dear sweet sister, Sister Emily. I am excited to hear from you all and looking forward to all that you have to offer.
Thank you, Michael, for that framing. It is so helpful to get that as we get underway here. I'm going to introduce our speakers in the order that they'll be speaking. Up first, we will have Emily Wirzba, who is the manager for government relations at the Environmental Defense Fund. Before coming to EDF, Wirzba worked for the Friends Committee on National Legislation, where she worked to achieve bipartisan recognition of climate change and action in Congress. She served as co-chair for the Washington Interreligious Staff Communities Energy and Ecology Working Group. Her writings have appeared in The Hill, CNN, U.S. News and World Report, and the Washington Times. She will be followed by Clarence Edwards, who is the Legislative Director for Sustainable Energy and Environment at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Before his present work, Edwards' career spanned from advising the Australian Embassy in the US to advocacy for the Sabine Vaccine Institute, the One Campaign, and the Enough Project. He has served as a congressional appropriations liaison for the Department of Energy, managed congressional outreach for the Council on Foreign Relations, and served in the Bureau of Public Affairs at the Department of State. And then our third and final speaker will be Anthony Rogers-Wright. He is the Green New Deal policy lead for the Climate Justice Alliance. Rogers-Wright has 15 years of experience in advancing justice while serving as a policy analyst for various environmental consulting firms in California and Colorado. He specialized in land use, Clean Air Act, and the environmental justice compliance. Over his career, he has additionally advanced struggles pertaining to affordable healthcare access, income inequality, and civil rights for LGBTQI citizens. Grist has highlighted his work in naming him as one of 50 people you'll be talking about. We are excited to have each of you with us today. Emily, if you would go ahead and get us started.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. I want to just say it's really fun to be speaking to this audience. I'm sure so many of my old friends and colleagues are here, and so thank you all for having me. And I also just want to start off by naming again how it's been such an awful week for so many people with the violence and the direct attacks on our democracy and white supremacy just being on full display. So I just hope that everyone is staying as safe as possible and healthy during this really difficult time. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit about what I see as possible in Congress and the administration. And there's so much to cover, so I'll try to be concise. And I want to give an overview of kind of the state of play and some of the logistics and issues that Congress is going to be focused on these first few weeks, because I think that will really also shape the window of possibilities for climate action moving forward. So a few different things. First, the Georgia election results will give Democratic control to the Senate. So this won't formally happen until both of the Georgia senators their races have been certified and they've been installed, and that the Biden-Harris administration has been sworn in. So at that point, then Kamala Harris will be the tie-breaking vote, giving control to the Democrats of the Senate. So currently, Senators McConnell and Schumer are going through working at a power sharing agreement to try to figure out things like, will Republicans and Democrats have an equal number of members on each committee? What happens if there's a tie vote within the committee, kind of how hearings will work. But the really big thing is that Schumer will now control what actually gets a vote on the Senate floor. This really matters. This is a huge deal. I also want to speak a little bit about the vote thresholds necessary to pass anything into law. So as you can imagine, passing legislation in an evenly divided Senate is going to be incredibly challenging. It'll require that the Democratic majority remain united with no defections and no absences. And it might require the vice president to abandon her executive branch business and come to the Senate to cast tie-breaking votes. It's a little bit unclear still if Schumer will plan to bring bills to the floor for a vote if he doesn't think it can meet the 60 vote threshold. We'll have to just see how that plays out and if he'll be kind of less strict about that than Senator McConnell was. And then it's also important to talk about the filibuster, which essentially requires a 60 vote threshold in order to pass legislation. You need 50 votes to get rid of the filibuster. And you already have at least one Democratic senator, Senator Manchin, that's publicly opposed to getting rid of the filibuster. So this means that for now, you'll still, in most cases, need 60 votes to pass legislation. So just to be really clear about that, that means that you'll need 10 Republicans to vote with all Democrats. So in some ways, that takes really big bills off the table for now, although I want to be clear that that could change if Democrats get too frustrated by the lack of action. And unfortunately, on the House side, things will be incredibly close as well. So it'll require a pretty similar level of unanimity in moving legislation. You know, Democrats will only be able to afford to lose a couple of votes on any given bill that they're working on. And just before delving into climate policy, I think it's important to just acknowledge what the Senate is doing like these next couple of weeks. So the big one, impeachment. The House this afternoon will be voting on impeachment, which will then go to the Senate. And it's a little bit unclear if the Senate will choose to focus on impeachment first, or if they'll be able to do nominations kind of simultaneously to confirm all of Biden's cabinet appointments. And so I think that's kind of another really big difference that the Georgia election has for the Senate, is that Biden's cabinet nominations will be a lot easier to get confirmed because those only require a 50-vote threshold. So to me, this right away is a really great opportunity for the faith community to be involved, to get senators to ask questions if they want to have those answers on the record. This could be a great place, for example, to lift up and ask cabinet nominees how they plan to prioritize environmental justice and equity issues in their federal agency work. But I think it's important to know that impeachment and nominations will be kind of front of mind for the Senate, and that could eat up some political capital. I think it's also important to name that individual senators will have a lot more power right now, meaning you have this group of moderate senators, people like Manchin, Collins, Murkowski, Romney, who could sway the outcome of a vote pretty easily. We might see kind of new groups in the middle coming together, bipartisan groups, to try to come up with compromise solutions. But on the flip side, if things are too moderate, you're at risk of losing progressive votes on things. And so it's going to be a really interesting balance just to see how that plays out and how unified the parties will be in their policy. Getting to climate policy, there are only 2 years really guaranteed with Democratic control of both the House and the Senate. So I think a lot of people are urging really swift action from both Congress and the administration. But despite all that, Congress is still operating under the political realities and constraints that I just mentioned. So I want to talk about a few ways that I think Congress might try to advance climate policy in these next 2 years. So Senator Schumer sent a letter this week to his colleagues where he says, quote, "We will consider bold legislation to defeat the climate crisis by investing in clean infrastructure and manufacturing, which will create millions of good jobs for Americans, regardless of zip code." So right away, we kind of know that there's going to be a big push on infrastructure again. The House last year passed H.R. 2, the Moving Forward Act, which is a massive green infrastructure bill. There was also a bipartisan transportation infrastructure bill in the Senate that had a big climate section. So I think there's a lot of interest in reviving these ideas. Again, that would most likely need to have a 60-vote threshold to pass, but I would really recommend to you all, if there are bills that you want to see passed, think about if you could get them incorporated into this larger package. So one example might be just transition policies like the Reclaim Act. Could you get that included? Or environmental justice bills, or more funding for LIHEAP? Like, are there kind of existing policy priorities that you could have attached? Another example, something that EDF is working on, thinking about transportation electrification. Could we get some electrification of medium and heavy duty trucks attached to a larger infrastructure package? So really seeing what those big moving pieces are and how you can incorporate your policy priorities there. The other kind of big push we'll probably see will be through this process called budget reconciliation. And to me, this might be the opportunity to see like the biggest climate action take place. So some of you might have been hearing about budget reconciliation. It's incredibly wonky, but the broad brushstrokes is that under this law called the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, if Congress passes a budget resolution and then committees are supposed to create legislation to kind of carry out the instructions, the tax and spending plans outlined in that budget resolution, that legislation is actually guided by a special rule under the Senate, which limits debate and prevents a filibuster, which means that you would only need a simple majority to pass that budget reconciliation legislation. So a lot of people are seeing this as a great opportunity to pass some climate policy. You can't use reconciliation for anything. You're only allowed to do mandatory spending or things that tweak the tax code, but there are still a lot of possibilities to advance climate. You could use it for a clean electricity standard or a price on carbon, newer, stronger tax credits, research and development funding, infrastructure investments. Some are thinking that this could be the opportunity to try to mandate carbon-free electricity by 2035. So people are doing a lot of creative brainstorming right now about what this could look like, including with some of the mandatory spending programs. Could you somehow tweak those so there could be a just transition away from fossil fuels? Perhaps you could establish an infrastructure bank with a green focus, right? So we think that there might be several attempts over the next couple of years to use this reconciliation process. We're hearing that there might be one on COVID and healthcare. There might be one that's focused on climate change. All that timing is still a little bit in flux, but I think we can expect to hear a lot about this tool in particular. I also think that we can kind of use climate as a lens to look at all legislation that Congress might work on this coming term, right? Whether it's trade policy, defense policy, spending, how do we get Congress to really incorporate climate change and community resiliency and environmental justice in everything that they're doing? We can expect to see more opportunities with the appropriations process. Perhaps there's certain line items or programs or accounts that could be increased that the faith community really cares about. So trying to get more explicit funding for those things. And then finally, briefly, we might hear some talk about something called the Congressional Review Act, the CRA, which is a law passed back in 1996 that basically says within 60 days of a regulation being finalized by the executive branch, a majority in both kind of houses of Congress can vote to nullify it. This can't be filibustered. You only need a majority in the Senate, not the usual 60 votes to overturn that. And so we might see an attempt to undo some of the Trump administration's harmful rules, like the Trump administration, the secret science rule of the EPA, that could be overturned with the CRA. And I want to note also, though, that there are some groups on this call, I think, that are probably opposed to using that as a tool, and EDF itself doesn't have a position right now on that, but it is something that people are exploring. I think also in the House, it's worth mentioning that the House Rules Committee this year got rid of what they call the pay-go spending requirement for both climate change and COVID policy, which could shift the type of climate policy that the House considers, because basically that means that spending increases don't actually have to be offset by tax increases or cuts in spending anymore. So that'll be kind of another interesting opportunity to look at. So I think when I'm looking at Congress, I see some real opportunities for the faith community, whether that's submitting questions before nomination hearings of cabinet appointees, whether that's urging prioritization of climate change and environmental justice with kind of every bill that they're looking at, including reconciliation, whether that's through the appropriations process, really highlighting those key accounts, and even kind of statements and letters urging greater ambition from Congress. And I know my time is running out, so just really briefly on the administration side, I think it's important to note that on the campaign trail, Biden made a ton of first day pledges for executive orders that he hopes to do on climate change. There are a lot that I could list that I won't. You can kind of Google list to kind of see what he's promised. We can probably expect him to announce that the US will rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. We expect to see kind of broad executive orders to help decarbonize the power sector and our transportation system, to conserve public lands and waters, to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So there's a lot that Biden can do. And I think I'm really excited by a lot of his cabinet members that he's been appointing, who are each going to bring their own set of climate expertise and environmental justice experience. I think the president-elect and his team have really made it clear that they plan to prioritize communities of color and low-income communities. And so it'll be really important to hold them accountable to that and ensure that they're actually doing that. And I think it's exciting that Biden has created 2 new climate positions with Gina McCarthy and John Kerry coming to take care of advanced kind of domestic and international climate action. And then there's a lot of damage that this Biden administration will have to undo that has been done over the past 4 years. So I think there's so many things that Biden can do with his executive authority. And the big question for me is how much will he choose to do versus how much will he kind of prefer happens through Congress. So now that there's a Democratic majority in both the Senate and the House, he might prefer to see Congress take more action, but I think that kind of remains to be seen. And so to me, I'm kind of starting this new year optimistic. I think we have a lot more opportunities and things won't necessarily be easy, but I'm really excited for what's to come. And I'm really excited to talk more on this webinar about the recommendations for a faithful environmental agenda and to really kind of talk through and think about what those priorities are and how they can be lifted up by this Congress and administration. So Thanks for having me. I'll stop now and really looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that comprehensive and helpful overview of the lay of the land right now. We'll now turn things over to Clarence. Go ahead, Clarence.
Thank you very much, Brooks, and thank you everyone for dialing into this Zoom conversation today. I hope that everyone out there is doing well and staying safe and healthy in this really turbulent moment in our history. You know, representing the Friends Committee on National Legislation and working with a larger group of organizations in the Washington Interfaith staff community, in this job, I've noticed the climate crisis is obviously a political, social, and economic crisis rolled into one. But it's also a moral and ethical crisis that's challenging the view that we have, humanity's view of our relationship with this planet. And I think it is forcing us to call into question what that relationship is and reevaluate it. And that's, to say the least, a pretty heavy thing. And that's happening in a climate that is increasingly lacking civil discourse, obviously, as we saw last Wednesday, to say the least. And it's really difficult to find common ground. But in that environment, it's really important for us to remember the values that make us who we are as a nation and as human beings. It's my belief the faith community has a really major role in helping our society to remember who we are as a nation and human beings right now. This is a real moment for the faith community. FCNL, in collaboration with other members of the Washington Interfaith staff community, we've united across theological lines by a commitment to care for all of creation and to serve vulnerable communities. And we support policies that will safeguard creation, address the impacts of climate change on the most vulnerable in the US and around the world, and to fulfill our obligation to leave a habitable world for future generations. And some of the policies that we support include, well, just more broadly speaking, we have a set of faith principles, and I'll outline those for you. We believe it's really important, number one, to support frontline and vulnerable communities that have been impacted by the negative externalities of the hydrocarbon economy. These are externalities that have been manifested in the impacts on people's health in vulnerable communities, poor and marginalized communities, and by a degradation of the physical environment of people who are living close to coal mines, coal plants, oil refineries across the nation. We believe that it's important to accelerate the transition to a clean economy and to commit to a net zero climate pollution by 2035 and economy-wide by 2050. And we also believe it's important to invest in climate resiliency and sustainable infrastructure. These are two things that will help facilitate a transition, a just transition to a workforce that has clean energy jobs and support and job training for workers who are transitioning out of this hydrocarbon economy. And lastly, as I said before, it's really important that we honor creation by promoting the protection and conservation of public lands. How do we achieve these? These are high-flying principles. How do we achieve them? We think it's important to emphasize and prioritize environmental justice. As I said before, for decades, low-income people of color have suffered under increasingly degraded environments. When you look at congressional legislation and appropriations, funding in the US government for environmental justice has been, even before the Trump administration, it's just been woefully underfunded. So we support greater investment in environmental justice programs at the EPA and as we move forward across the federal government in various government agencies. Achieving net zero climate pollution by 2050, it's important to accelerate the transition to wind, solar, geothermal, so that we reach net zero in the electricity sector by 2035. That includes building out a zero carbon grid, And those are jobs, those are good jobs that can help to support a lot of communities. Investments, this ties into investments in sustainable infrastructure. Emily mentioned some of the legislation that's going to be moving forward on Capitol Hill. We're particularly interested at FCNL and in other groups in looking at infrastructure packages, an infrastructure package that may be coming down the pathways late winter and early spring. I think that's going to be a major piece of legislation as part of the way that we address climate. And on the global scale, fully funding international climate finance, including the US contribution to the Green Climate Fund and re-entering the Paris Climate Accords. But let me finish by saying that we hear a lot about the technicalities around what's important to do for the climate, and that is obviously extremely important. And I believe that this is important for the entire faith community. We need to have a greater awareness of that moral and ethical responsibility that we have to each other as human beings and to this planet. Because we can make all of these changes. We can achieve a low carbon economy. But if we don't really re-examine who we are as human beings on this planet and how we interact with the natural world and our role as not separate from the natural world, but as a key part of Mother Nature, then all the changes that we're striving to make will not make a difference. So I'm hoping that, and I'm looking forward to the conversation, but I'm hoping that as the faith community, we can raise that message of what is our relationship to nature and to this planet, and how do we move forward in a balanced and harmonious way. So I'm looking forward to talking with you, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Clarence, for grounding us in our values as we think about what's possible in the coming year. And we'll now transition to our third and final panelist, Anthony Rogers-Wright. Go ahead, Anthony.
Well, thank you, everyone, so much for this incredible opportunity. Emily and Clarence, amazing synopses from both of you. You know, I think that I would just start by saying, you know, even though I'm Jewish, I'm going to lift up St. Augustine real quick, and the God is light, light is good, God is good analogy to white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonization are also moral issues, which therefore means that climate change is a moral issue. And, you know, to that end, we have to get to the root causes of this crisis. And that's what we've seen last week is vindicates that. It illuminates that, right? Because while some people refer to it as a coup, me, myself, you know, I refer to it as an attempt to maintain the status quo through acts of violence, right? What we are trying to do and what we must do could also be characterized as a coup in that we are trying to deracinate the status quo because that is the only way we are going to have climate survival. If we have 10 years to address the climate crisis efficaciously, we have less than that amount of time to dismantle and decapitate white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonization. This is just a requisite to get to where we would need to go. This has to be a bottom-up process. I agree with Sister Emily in that there are all kinds of possibilities, but we also have to be realistic at what a divided Congress can actually do. Some have been referring to it as a Dem trifecta, and I've been referring it to more of as a Dem tri-slim, as in a Dem tri-slim majority. And Democrats might be extremely ginger and careful in what it takes to maintain that majority. You don't have to agree with Sister Pelosi's politics, but she is, and her political prowess and her abilities as a politician cannot be denied. And the same goes for Brother Schumer. as well. So, that's really, really important. And I think that this is also a fight that entails federal agencies, and we cannot forget that. Even today, we heard that the Trump administration, EPA, has blocked some rules on PFAS in water, which is hurting our people right now, Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor white folk who we fight for at CJA, and who all of us fight for. So also, to Sister Emily's point, we also have to push Congress to use the Congressional Review Act to eliminate these harmful agency rules, which also requires just a simple majority. So that's really important, because these rules are hurting our people right now. Whether it was Andrew Wheeler ending air quality monitoring during a global pandemic, or a disease that attacks the respiratory system. Our respiratory systems were already being attacked. Places like Cancer Alley, 48217 in Michigan, Detroit, Bronx, New York, all throughout the Gulf South, and of course in many places in California. So it's really, really important that we attack that immediately as well, because this is hurting our people right now. As I like to say, our people have been getting choked out by toxic policies, toxic police, and toxic processes for far too long. And that's the opportunity that we have to take. I also want to lift up the importance of local and municipal fights. Lots of the times I was talking to my good brother, Reverend Michael, about this when we were in DC last, eating African food at my sister's house, which the brother Michael does not lie. He can handle spicy food because he was eating my sister's food with a smile on his face. And that's just an important thing. But the local municipal fights, from public service commissions, public utility commissions, county commissioners, judges, DAs, these impact the everyday lives of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor white folk. And we need to show that same energy that we showed in Georgia for the federal work as we and at the local work as well. And that also builds the groundwork for the federal interventions that we will have to utilize in 2022. Because Sister Emily and Brother Clarence are absolutely right, Brother Michael. We won in Georgia. But let's be clear, what happened wasn't like this Jesse Owens versus some slow white German. This was a photo finish where we put our chests out and broke the ribbon. You know what I'm saying? And the amount of work we had to put in even for that was incredible. And so that's really important. And also what I want to say is that, it is really, really important. There are many things that we can get through via reconciliation as it pertains to finances, but the social issues that we need to get through: free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous people, respect for their sovereignty, bringing back treaties, all of these things cannot be done with reconciliation. So we are going to have to push this Congress to get rid of the filibuster for the real things that we need to push through to lift up and act as edification for our communities. I do want to talk about the Thrive agenda that Brother Malcom and I work on with the National Green New Deal Network. 8 pillars that are about the climate crisis, jobs, and justice, because the time for silos is over. We cannot prioritize, we'll take care of this, then we'll get to racial justice, then we'll get to gender justice, then we'll get to immigrant justice. This is all connected, all synergized. We have to not just use the words of Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, we have to exercise the words and theories of Dr. Crenshaw. Intersectionality is a verb, not a woke vernacular saying to make us look more intelligent than we really are. We have to practice this. And what I would also say is that what this is going to really also entail is our white, green, big green groups exercising manifest empathy in lieu of manifest destiny, right? And what that means is like really seeing, and hearing from us, not just listening to us, but really hearing us, right? Because yes, KXL has made a big issue, DAPL, and so was, and now Line 3, but Cancer Alley is still in existence, and it was in existence before that. And we know damn well that if it was Cancer Hills or Cancer Oaks or Scars Cancerdale or Chap Cancer Quad, not only would that issue be handled, but there might not even be cancer anymore. But because Cancer Alley is happening to Black folk, right? It is, and the dehumanization of Black folk throughout history, it is seen as somehow okay, even by our own guild. So that's my plea to everyone right now. Put Cancer Alley at the same level as DAPL, as Line 3, as KXL, because these are real lives. 5 years ago, when an organization I was working for helped bring over about 80 students from HBCUs, I met a sister. It was her first time on an airplane when she came over to Paris. 14 members of her family all have cancer, and they live in Cancer Alley, are all Black, sharecroppers and whatnot. So this is a really, really important issue. And I think that I will stop there because that's a lot. And I look forward to the robust discussion.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Michael, would you like to help us get started with the questions?
Let me just first say, wow, wow, wow. Brooks, I don't know about you, but that was a great deal of substance and a whole lot that we can actually put our teeth in to be busy as clergy. My question, well, one of the things that I just heard Anthony say that I really picked up on was manifest empathy versus manifest destiny. Brother Anthony, what does that look like in a practical sense for, and maybe Brother Clarence or Emily, you can jump in if Brother Anthony can't jump on right away. But manifest empathy and manifest destiny, what does that look like? Manifest empathy in a practical sense for us today, given all that's happening. What does that look like for us in a practical sense today in the halls of Congress?
I mean, I'll jump in. I love the phrase manifest empathy. I think the word empathy jumps out because of the paucity, because of the lack of it in every direction in American society today. We're just blind to, collectively, we're just blind to other people, other groups' pain. And it's to reach that empathy. To me, James Baldwin, that famous quote where he talks about people holding on to their anger because otherwise, and I'm paraphrasing it, but I think a lot of us know it, otherwise they would be left with their sadness. I mean, what you're seeing right now is just that the anger that is spilling out, and there's just sadness and fear. And I'm not condoning at all what happened last week, but when you get a crowd of people that get to that point, that's fear. That's fear and sadness. And I'm not excusing it, but we've got to break through and understand. I keep saying I'm not condoning it, but it's just, to me, it's just this manifestation of anger, fear, and sadness. And I feel like we have to figure that out before we make any progress on climate. Because as I said before, we can make a lot of progress technically and politically on climate, and we'll be left with the same bitterness, hatred, and anger. So we've got to address, and to me, empathy is, we need people to understand where everyone is right now and understand how we all got here and washed up on the shores of this hydrocarbon economy that it's done a lot for us, but has also left us with a lot of pain and bitterness. So manifest empathy is this society stepping back and saying, what are we doing to each other? And how do we stop doing this to each other?
Right. I love that. I love that. One of the things, Emily, that you talked about was how we can use our faith in halls of decision making in the Congress. I wrote down that faith asks questions and holds accountable. How do you see faith asking questions and holding accounts accountable, especially in this light of this new term that I just took from Anthony, and I would give credit for the rest of this show, and then after that it's mine. But in light of manifest empathy, how does faith ask questions and hold accountable? And then Brooks, after that, you can grab it back. I just had to get those two out because they were burning.
Yeah, well, I love that phrase too, and I'm going to be spending a lot of time thinking about that and what that means for myself personally and my organization and my work. But I think to me, what's always been so powerful about the faith community is this this ability to speak with moral clarity and to really call out what it means to love our neighbor, right? And so there's this prophetic voice that the faith community has, and I think that can cut through a lot of the partisan discord and a lot of the hate and like the arguments going back and forth. There's like this moral clarity that the religious community can speak to, and so for me, it's asking those questions to members of Congress and holding them accountable to taking care of the least of these, to lifting up the intersectional nature of climate change and climate justice, and who's being left behind as the solutions are being put together, right? Who's not in the room, who aren't being included, and who's not benefiting. And I think the faith community can remind members of Congress of maybe promises they made on the campaign trail, or even if they haven't made those promises in the first place, of kind of what their obligation is to other people, to our neighbors, both kind of here at home, but also abroad and around the world. And so I think the religious community, more than most, have this ability to kind of cut through the division and to name that explicitly. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Emily, for that response. We have a question in the Q&A box here from Andrew King Bartlett, which I'm really thinking of in terms of, Emily, your comment about the 60 vote minimum or requirement. So what Andrew asks is there interest, momentum for pushing forward the Green New Deal and or the Thrive agenda that Anthony referenced as an umbrella framework? If not, what, if anything, happens with those overarching platforms? Would any one of you like to take a stab at responding to that?
I mean, I'll jump in. I mean, in terms of an overarching, to me, I see the Green New Deal as being it's a momentum driver. I credit the Green New Deal. I frankly think that the Green New Deal, its release really encouraged a lot of people. It forced a lot of people on the other side of the aisle to think, well, we might have to get serious about this. Otherwise, this is going to happen. So I think I don't personally see the Green New Deal as necessarily a piece of concrete legislation. It's more of a statement of principles that can help drive the discussion. And I credit it with really pushing this issue into the center of politics over the past year. So that's how I see it. I think in a way, it's almost like a cudgel. And it's elbowed the conversation into a different space.
Yeah, and I would maybe just say, even if something like the Thrive agenda can't be passed as a standalone bill on the Senate floor, just given the 60 vote threshold, since the filibuster still is in place, I think it can still be used as an important guiding post or framework where if legislators are able to move particular pieces of transportation policy or something to help push clean energy, they can kind of connect it back to that larger framework and show kind of how they're incorporating equity, how they're making it intersectional, and just like kind of using that as the guiding post, even if it's impossible to pass something like that kind of with an up or down vote.
There's another question that was in the Q&A that asked about the filibuster. I'm not sure if we got to that yet or not, but it was asked to Emily, how likely is it that we'll get rid of the filibuster?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now, in order to get rid of the filibuster, you need 50 votes. And so I don't think there are 50 senators on record saying they would vote to get rid of the filibuster. And kind of, if you're looking at just like the 50 Democrats or those who are caucusing with the Democrats, Joe Manchin has already said publicly that he does not support getting rid of the filibuster, which means you don't have that 50 vote threshold right now. But I guess a lot of what I've been hearing and reading is that even if we start out the Congress keeping the filibuster in place, that doesn't mean that's the case for the rest of the term, right? I think anything could happen and members can change their mind, especially if they get frustrated at the lack of action. So right now, it doesn't look like that's the first kind of strategy goal, just because it doesn't seem super likely in the moment, but that could change. I'm not sure if Clarence or Anthony, if you've heard otherwise.
Yeah, no, I think it's. I don't see getting rid of the filibuster has its downsides too in the long run, which is why it hasn't happened. You know, they had the quote unquote nuclear option a few years ago, and number one, there are enough institutionalists and Senate institutionalists in the chamber now that I don't think that it would happen. And then number two, you have to think long term. It's just like you can use a weapon to get what you want. And then 5 or 10 years down the road, that same weapon can be used against you. And to me, it's something that my personal view is we should proceed cautiously with something like getting rid of the filibuster. And I think a lot of people on the Hill feel that way too.
Great, thank you for those perspectives and thoughts. We have another question here in the Q&A box. In the opinion of the panel, what single act can we do to further environmental change? Or, to put a finer point on it, is there a specific area of those many things, Emily, that you mentioned earlier or that have been mentioned since? Is there one particular area? Should we all be focusing on reconciliation budgets and so forth, or what should we be focusing on?
It's hard to pick just one. I mean, I always go back to the most important thing you can do is advocate in your local community. And for me, I think that can look like a variety of things. But being able to go in and talk with your members of Congress and their staff, and actually starting that citizen lobbying process and letting them know kind of what those important goals are, I think we have a really good chance to both decarbonize our electric sector and our transportation sectors, and to push for environmental justice and equity policies within that. And so I think, like, I know that's not just one thing, but I think being able to go in and speak with your representatives and say, like, whatever the venue looks like, whether you do decide to use reconciliation, or whether you are going to move a big infrastructure package, or whether it's, just making sure that they know that you as a constituent care about those issues.
I would echo what Emily says there, because these issues are really complex and complicated in a way, and then in a way they're not. And I think one of the most important things for people to do is educate yourself about the issues and engage and I totally agree with Emily, engage your local members. Members of Congress respond to their constituents expressing their interest in an issue. And if you go in and you talk to your member and you let them know that climate isn't some nebulous thing that quote unquote elites on the coast are interested in, it is, we're all climate activists, whether you want to be or not, because we live in the world and we live on planet Earth, and your environment, you are the environment. We are the environment. So let people in power know that you're interested in these issues and tell them what you want to see. I think that's one of the most important things people can do. People in general have to mobilize to move this issue forward, and to let people in power know that this is the issue that we care about and that we want you to do something about.
Clarence, I think you're absolutely right. I also think that in looking at it, that's exactly where we need to be pushing. We need to be pushing because we only have a slim majority, and basically we need a 60-40. And we know that even in that, our majority with progressives is even slimmer. So we're working with moderates. We as the people have to let them know what we want and what we want to have put in place in order for it to happen. Because if not, it'll still remain the same, just a little bit calmer and a little bit more saner. But nevertheless, the progress will still be the same, and that we'll still be losing. So for me, we have to maintain the same push. One of the questions in the chat, even in looking at that push, one of the processes that's been put out before us to get us started is carbon tax. What is your opinion on carbon tax? A lot of economists have said that that's one of the best ways to get us started. What is your opinion on it, and what is your push about that, in particular when you look at environmental justice, Brother Clarence?
FCNL supports a price on carbon. And I've had to do a lot of research since starting this job in September, but to me, if the issue is greenhouse gas emissions and carbon being the largest and most troublesome, how do we solve problems we're in a capitalist economy, okay? How do we solve problems in a capitalist economy? Usually we put a price on something, it's about the market. So let's use the market to address this problem. You can use carbon for a lot of different things, but if the issue is to regulate and do something about carbon, to me, the most direct route one method to do that is to put a price on it and drive its consumption down. I know that there are concerns that a price on carbon doesn't necessarily address environmental justice, but to me, you can design legislation to mitigate that. You can design legislation that puts fees from a carbon tax into part of the fees into a trust fund. You can direct it in certain ways. You can a trust fund that would go towards funding environmental justice programs. So there are a lot of ways to design a price on carbon, but just in my opinion, I think that is one of the best solutions. And I know that the legislative environment, whenever you talk about taxes, unless it's cutting them, no one's in favor of them. But I think that the dynamics exist in the Congress, maybe not initially, but it probably sometime later this year, to have a real conversation, or maybe through reconciliation, I don't know, maybe in a couple of weeks. But there's a dynamic that exists where we can look at a price on carbon as a really effective tool. And I think that with the political and economic dynamics of the country changing rapidly, I think it's something that it's a live possibility. So we support it.
Okay. How about I see that Anthony's back on. Anthony, what's your opinion on carbon price?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, Reverend. And I would say that I'm in agreement with like 30 to 40% of what Brother Clarence brought up. It's important, one, that we are careful with our vernacular and our parlance first and foremost, because what we're really after is emissions, right? We've got hydrofluorocarbons, co-pollutants, methane, carbon dioxide, et cetera, that are all impacting our communities, frontline, fence line communities first and worst. So it's a very nuanced idea. Coming from Seattle, we are the state where carbon price legislation goes to die, but we have to look at like why they have been dying in Washington State. I-732 was mainly a big green white construct that was extremely racist and didn't include Black, Brown, and Indigenous folk in the process. So we killed it. I-1631, which was supposed to be a better version of that, more inclusive, but the exemptions were so big, like energy intensive industries were exempted. The coal-fired power plant in Washington State was exempted. And that's ultimately why that failed. And going back to the idea of going from the bottom up, right? We do have some very promising emission pricing schemes coming out of New York State with the amazing New York Renews Coalition, the Climate and Community Investment Act, because of how it is structured. As Brother Clarence was saying, 40% of what is raised in that revenue is going to fund the just transition, is going to EJ communities. So I do hear a lot of people saying like, oh, price and dividend and send everybody an individual check. But that's another issue of capitalism, is individual consumerism. And you can't get out of a climate crisis with individual consumerism. This is a global, regional, state, and local issue. So, I mean, I would say that I do not agree with the approach of the Citizens Climate Lobby. I do not think that goes far enough. You have to be careful of emission pricing schemes that are actually backed by the fossil fuel industry, because anything that's backed by the fossil fuel industry should, give you a Pavlovian reaction that there's probably something not right with this. So I would say that there is a way for it to work, but with caveats. One, it cannot be viewed as an emissions reduction tool. It is not an emissions reduction tool. Even the most draconian emission pricing schemes in Sweden did not reduce emissions. In British Columbia, as a matter of fact, emissions somehow went up. So we have to understand that we're also going to have to regulate these emissions in addition to this emissions scheme. Now, from a moral perspective, this is the only industry right now. I think Brother Bill McKibben, when I was on a panel with him, said it best. I mean, that doesn't have to pay for cleaning up its garbage. If you own a restaurant, if you own a home, Brother Malcolm, you're talking about house repairs right now. You've got to pay for what you don't use to be taken to a landfill or whatnot. That comes out of your taxes. That might come out of your home owners association, et cetera, et cetera. This industry, is just emitting, and not having to pay for that, and that is extremely problematic. I do think that, again, as Brother Clarence was saying, that it could work, but again, with those caveats, this is not going to reduce emissions alone, which is why we're also against false mechanisms like cap and trade, or cap and invest, or cap and dividend. That's just allowing the emissions to still occur at source. And that's the issue, right there. Where are these things being emitted from? Black, brown, indigenous, and poor white communities. So what is the mechanism to reduce those emissions? We've also talked about ideas like cap, slap, and tax. And the idea of there is a cap on what you can emit every year. If you go above that, you will be slapped with a tax, but also a reduction tool of just like in EJ communities, which is why it's important to lift up new pieces of legislation like those coming from Senator Ed Markey on an EJ mapping tool. We can't keep talking about EJ communities in this abstract idea. These are real communities with real people. We need to know where they are so that the tax or the fee in those communities is 3 times higher than it is anywhere else, because we got to have that negative incentive that we are not any longer going to be your sacrifice zones so that affluent white people can cool and heat their homes. That's not going to work moving forward. So yeah, so that's what I would say is that it's very, very nuanced, and we need to dig in and have deeper discussions. But the Climate Community Investment Act coming out of New York, led by UPROSE, New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and Push Buffalo Working Families Party, is a very good model that I think we can scale up and scale out.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Brooks, I know we're at the end, and I wanted to find out if you had anything else, because I'd like to actually end us in prayer today. I think it's apropos for where we are.
Yeah, Michael, thank you so much. This has been quite the webinar, insightful throughout. Thank you to all of our panelists. And if you could please bring us home with some prayer, it'd be much appreciated.
Thank you. Let us pray. To you who we call by many names, we say thank you. We thank you for the progresses that we've made, and we ask that you would strengthen us to push, to continue to fight, continue to lift and uplift those who have often underseen and underserved. We pray that you would continue to give us courage to fight for democracy, fight for justice, fight for equity, and above all things, continue to give us your presence in this fight. We thank you now for the life of each and every one that inhabits this planet, each and every creation that inhabits this planet. We ask that you would help us to be better stewards, better ambassadors for you and your creation. In your name we do pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks again to all of our panelists, and thank you to everyone who joined us for today. We will be putting together an email as soon as this gets uploaded onto YouTube. We'll have the recording there for people to access on YouTube. And actually, there's a recording right now on the Pollinator Facebook page if you're anxious to get to it. And we'll be back next month where Michael and I are putting the final touches on what promises to be a great webinar again next month. So stay tuned. We'll put that all in an email coming out soon. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, you all.